There is a sentence in the Bible that almost no theologian has ever been able to fully explain without contradicting something else they believe. It sits in Romans chapter 7, verse 15, and Paul writes it in the first person, as a confession, not as a description of someone else. "I do not understand what I do," he writes. "For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do." Read that carefully. The man who wrote more of the New Testament than anyone else, who had been caught up to the third heaven according to his own testimony, who had planted churches across the known world, who had suffered beatings, shipwrecks, imprisonment, and near death for his faith, is sitting down and admitting that there is something inside him that he cannot control, something that wants one thing and does the opposite, something that seems to operate completely independently of his intention, his will, and his belief. And the explanation for what Paul is describing was not articulated with this level of psychological precision again until Carl Jung began writing about the human unconscious in the early 20th century, nearly 2,000 years later. Before explaining what Jung's framework reveals about Romans 7, it is worth establishing exactly what Romans 7 is actually describing, because this passage is one of the most debated in all of New Testament scholarship, and the debate itself reveals something important. The central question is who Paul is talking about when he says "I." Is this Paul, before his conversion, describing his life under the law before he met Jesus on the road to Damascus? Is it Paul after his conversion, describing the ongoing struggle of a genuine believer? Or is it a rhetorical device, a generalized description of any human being confronting the demands of God's law without the power to meet them? The reason the debate matters is that each reading has enormous implications. If Paul is describing the pre-conversion self, then the Christian life is supposed to be free of this war, and anyone still experiencing it is somehow failing. If Paul is describing the post-conversion believer, then the war within is a permanent and expected feature of genuine faith, not evidence of its absence. The majority of serious New Testament scholars today read it as Paul describing the ongoing experience of a believer, and the language itself supports this reading. Paul writes in the present tense throughout, not the past tense of someone looking back on a finished struggle. He writes as someone inside the experience, not observing it from a safe distance. And this is precisely where Jung's framework, applied carefully and honestly, illuminates something the theological debate alone has struggled to resolve. Jung's most foundational contribution to psychology was the distinction between what he called the ego and the shadow. The ego, in Jung's framework, is not the arrogant selfishness the word sometimes suggests in popular usage. It is simply the conscious self, the part of a person they are aware of, identify with, and can deliberately direct. The ego is the I that makes decisions, holds values, plans ahead, and understands itself to be a continuous person moving through time. What Jung called the shadow is everything else. It is the accumulated collection of impulses, desires, fears, and capacities that a person has either repressed or never fully acknowledged, pushed down below the threshold of awareness not because they ceased to exist, but because they were incompatible with the conscious image the person holds of themselves. The critical insight Jung arrived at, the one that makes Romans 7 suddenly readable in an entirely new way, is that the shadow does not disappear when it is repressed. It goes underground. It continues to operate, shaping behavior, generating impulses, producing reactions, all from a place beneath conscious awareness, which means that the person who is convinced they have eliminated a particular desire or weakness has often simply lost sight of it, while it continues to operate from a depth they cannot directly observe or control. Jung wrote that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. In other words, the more aggressively a person refuses to acknowledge the darker contents of their own inner life, the more power those contents accumulate. Now read Romans 7 again with that framework in mind. Paul writes, "I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now if I do what I do not want, I agree with the law that it is good. So now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me." Paul is describing, with startling psychological precision, exactly the dynamic Jung would later spend his career mapping. There is the conscious ego, the Paul who genuinely wants to do good, who agrees intellectually and spiritually with the law, who identifies himself with the desire to live rightly. And there is something else, what Paul calls sin dwelling within him, a force that operates independently of his conscious intention, producing the very behaviors his conscious self rejects and condemns. Paul continues in verse 21 through 23, "So I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inner being, but I see in my members another law waging war against the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members." That phrase, "another law waging war against the law of my mind," is one of the most psychologically precise descriptions of the ego-shadow conflict ever written in any language. Paul is not describing two equal and opposite forces in some kind of dualistic system where good and evil are balanced powers. He is describing an asymmetry, a conscious self with genuine values and genuine intentions, and a force operating from somewhere else inside him that repeatedly overrides those intentions at the moment of action. Jung identified something important about why this war feels so disorienting to the person experiencing it, and this is the part of his framework that explains why Paul's language sounds so confused and self-contradictory to a reader who has never honestly reckoned with their own inner division. The shadow, because it operates below the threshold of consciousness, does not feel like me when it acts. It feels like something happening to me. This is why Paul writes that it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. He is not evading responsibility with a theological technicality. He is accurately describing the phenomenological experience of shadow behavior, the fact that when a person acts from the shadow rather than from the ego, the action genuinely does not feel chosen in the way a fully conscious decision feels chosen. It breaks through, as Jung would say, from below. Here is where the connection between Jung's framework and the broader biblical narrative becomes even more significant, because the pattern Paul is describing in Romans 7 is not a problem that appears for the first time in the New Testament. It runs all the way back to Genesis chapter 4. After Cain's offering is rejected and he is angry, God speaks directly to him and says this, "Why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." The image God uses there is strikingly physical. Sin is described not as an abstract moral category, but as something crouching, waiting, with desire, a predatory posture just outside the threshold of conscious awareness. The language anticipates by thousands of years exactly the dynamic Jung would describe as the shadow lying in wait at the boundary between the unconscious and the conscious mind. And Cain, like Paul, like every human being after the fall, discovers that simply knowing the right thing to do provides no automatic power to do it. This detail in Genesis 4 is not an isolated observation. It is the first recorded description of what the rest of the Bible consistently calls the flesh, a term that does not mean the physical body in some dualistic sense of matter being evil, but rather the entire system of self-centered, God-independent desire and motivation that operates in every human being below the level of their stated values and intentions. When Jesus tells his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane, "Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation," the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. He is making the same distinction Paul will later formalize in Romans 7. There is a willing part and a weak part, a conscious aspiration and an unconscious pull, and the person who trusts only in the willing part while ignoring the weak part is the person who falls the moment the pressure is real. Peter, who insisted moments earlier that he would never deny Jesus, is the demonstration of exactly this principle within the same night. His ego was entirely sincere. His shadow, as Jung would say, had not been reckoned with. This is the problem Paul crystallizes in Romans 7, and it is a problem that has been the defining experience of every serious believer in every generation since. The person who has genuinely encountered Jesus Christ, who genuinely wants to live in obedience to God, who agrees in their conscious mind with everything God's law requires, still finds something else operating inside them that does not share those values, does not respond to those commitments, and does not yield to those intentions at the moment when the choice is actually made. This is not hypocrisy in the ordinary sense, pretending to believe something while privately not caring. It is something more disorienting than that. It is the experience of genuinely caring, genuinely wanting to live differently, and still finding yourself doing the thing you do not want to do. Jung's framework helps explain why the standard advice offered to people in this condition so often fails to actually help them. The advice is usually some version of try harder, want it more, make a firmer commitment, build better habits, be more disciplined. All of that advice operates entirely at the level of the conscious ego, the part that already wants the right thing. What it does not touch is the shadow, the layer beneath the ego where the competing force is actually operating. You cannot out-discipline the unconscious because discipline is a tool of the conscious mind, and the shadow exists precisely below the reach of that tool. Trying harder at the level of the ego while the shadow remains untouched and unacknowledged is, in Jung's framework, not the solution to the problem. It often makes the problem worse because increased conscious striving without genuine shadow integration tends to drive the shadow deeper, making it less visible to the conscious self while increasing the pressure it operates under. Paul arrives at the same conclusion at the end of Romans 7, expressed in language that sounds like despair but is actually a turning point. "Wretched man that I am," he cries out, "who will deliver me from this body of death?" The question is not rhetorical in the way we sometimes read it. Paul is genuinely identifying a problem that he cannot solve from within himself, using the tools of the ego through willpower, through commitment, through more careful rule-following. The deliverance he is asking about requires something that comes from outside the system of the self, because the problem is embedded inside the system in a way that the system cannot fix from within. And Paul's answer arrives immediately in Romans chapter 8. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. For the law of the Spirit of life has set you free in Christ Jesus from the law of sin and death. Notice the structure of the answer. The solution to the war described in Romans 7 is not a technique for managing the shadow more skillfully. It is a declaration of a new legal and spiritual status, no condemnation, and a new operative power, the Spirit of life, that Paul says has replaced what the law alone could never accomplish. Because the law, he explains in verse 3, was weakened by the flesh, which is to say, by the shadow, by the parts of human nature that the law addresses but cannot change by addressing. This is where the cross enters as the decisive event in the entire structure of the argument, and where the Christian answer to the war within diverges from anything Jung's psychology can offer on its own. Jung's solution to the shadow was what he called individuation, the long, difficult process of becoming conscious of the shadow's contents, integrating them into the personality, learning to acknowledge the dark parts of oneself without either suppressing them or being controlled by them. Individuation is genuine and valuable work, but it is entirely a human project, accomplished through self-examination, through honest encounter with one's own depths, through the long and painful work of becoming more fully and honestly oneself. It has no outside agent. There is no one absorbing the cost of the shadow's actions on the person's behalf. There is no forgiveness in the theological sense because there is no one to extend it. The cross changes the structure of the problem entirely. What Paul argues in Romans chapter 8 and throughout his letters is that Jesus Christ did not come primarily to teach a better technique for managing the shadow. He came to deal with what the shadow's actions have actually cost, both the legal guilt they produce before a holy God and the power they exercise over a person who has no internal resources sufficient to break it. The crucifixion absorbs the condemnation that the shadow's behavior rightly deserves. The resurrection breaks the power of the system the shadow operates within. This is why Paul can write in Romans 8 verse 2 that the law of the Spirit of life has set you free from the law of sin and death, language that deliberately echoes Romans 7's description of another law waging war against the law of my mind. The war Paul describes in chapter 7 is answered in chapter 8, not by a better strategy for winning the war from within, but by a power entering the conflict from outside that changes the terms of engagement entirely. The Holy Spirit, in Paul's account in Romans 8, is specifically described as performing the function that neither the law nor the unaided ego could perform, namely working from within a person to produce genuine conformity to what God requires, not as external compliance enforced by guilt and effort, but as inward transformation that changes what the person actually wants at the level where the wanting happens. In verse 13, Paul writes that if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. The mechanism of death for the shadow's works, in Paul's framework, is not ego effort alone. It is the Spirit operating at the level where ego effort cannot reach, which is precisely the level Jung identified as the unconscious, the place where the shadow lives and from which it launches its campaigns against the conscious self's intentions. This does not mean the war ends immediately or completely in this life. The tension between Romans 7 and Romans 8 is not a progression from the old life to the new, with chapter 7 describing a finished past and chapter 8 describing a settled present. It is more accurate to read them as two realities that coexist in the experience of every genuine believer: the ongoing reality of the shadow with its competing law, and the equally ongoing reality of the Spirit's presence and power. The Christian life, in Paul's account, is not the absence of the war, but the presence of a power that the war cannot ultimately defeat. The shadow continues to operate. The flesh continues to war against the Spirit. But the condemnation that the shadow's victories would otherwise produce has been absorbed at the cross, and the power that the shadow relies on has been fundamentally broken by the resurrection. What this leaves the believer with is not a finished struggle, but a changed position within the struggle. If the war Paul describes in Romans 7 is evidence of spiritual failure, then every believer who honestly examines their own inner life is in serious trouble, because the war is real. The pull toward the things the conscious self rejects is real, and it does not simply disappear after conversion. But if the war Paul describes in Romans 7 is the honest account of what genuine faith actually looks like from the inside, then the person experiencing it is not failing. They are exactly where Paul was. And the answer to their wretchedness, like Paul's, is not a technique but a person, not a strategy but a declaration. Not try harder, but there is therefore now no condemnation. The real question Romans 7 leaves you with is not whether you experience the war, because if you are honest, you do. Everyone who has ever taken seriously the call to live differently than their instincts demand has felt exactly what Paul describes: the gap between intention and action, between wanting and doing, between the self that agrees with God's law and the self that violates it before the conscious mind has finished forming the resolution not to. The real question is where you have been looking for the resolution to that gap. If you have been looking inside yourself, at your own willpower, your own discipline, your own commitment, your own capacity to manage what Jung would call the shadow, then Romans chapter 7 is exactly the diagnosis you need. And Romans chapter 8 is the only answer it has ever had.